Silence! I told you to translate, not to think. Do you think because you've sat in this office for 10 years that you've become one of us?
The humid heat of a Seoul July pressed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Hansung Tower. But inside the International Strategy Division, the air was a surgical, recycled chill. Anita Richard adjusted the cuff of her silk fuchsia blazer, a bold splash of color in a sea of charcoal suits. At 60, Anita moved with a deliberate, rhythmic grace that younger staffers mistook for slowness. They were wrong. It was the composure of a woman who had navigated 3 decades of corporate warfare across 2 continents. For 10 years, she had been the ghost of Hansung. Every successful pivot the company made into the EMEA markets had Anita's fingerprints on the strategy decks, yet her name never graced the cover page. "Anita, see!" A sharp, nasal voice barked. Anita didn't flinch. She turned to see Park Dae-hyun, the chairman's eldest son and the executive director. He was 54, wore suits that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and possessed the emotional maturity of a paper cut. "The London delegates are in Boardroom 4, Dae-hyun said, not looking at her, but at his reflection in a decorative mirror. "Make sure the tea is the right temperature, and don't expand on the talking points. Just translate exactly what I say. My vision doesn't need embellishment from the gallery." "The London brief mentions a concern regarding sustainable supply chains, Director," Anita said, her voice a rich, calm contralto. "If I might suggest—" "I didn't ask for a suggestion, Anita. I asked for a microphone that speaks English." He finally looked at her, his eyes raking over her silver strand hair and the deep mahogany hue of her skin with visible distaste. "Try to stay in the shadows today. Your aesthetic is a bit distracting for the traditional board members." He brushed past her, his cologne leaving a trail of aggressive scent. Anita stood still for a heartbeat, her jaw tightening. She wasn't a translator. She held an MBA from Wharton and had saved 2 Fortune 500 companies before Dae-hyun had learned to tie his own shoes. But in the hierarchy of Hansung, she was the foreigner. She was the older woman. The board meeting was a Shark Tank. The chairman sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of aging granite, watching his son struggle. Dae-hyun was drowning. The London investors were asking pointed questions about European Union regulatory shifts. Questions Anita had prepared answers for in a memo Dae-hyun had clearly tossed in the trash. "We are, looking into the protocols," Dae-hyun stammered, his face flushing a humiliated red. He looked at Anita, his eyes pleading for a lifeline, but his pride was even greater than his panic. Anita leaned forward, her voice steady and professional. "If I may clarify the director's point, the upcoming EU Directive 2024/SH is actually an opportunity for Hansung to—" "Silence!" Dae-hyun snapped, slamming his palm on the mahogany table. The boom echoed in the silent room. The London delegates blinked, startled. The chairman's eyes narrowed. Dae-hyun's embarrassment had turned into a toxic, cornered animal rage. He turned his chair toward Anita, loud enough for every board member to hear. "I told you to translate, not to think. Do you think because you've sat in this office for 10 years that you've become one of us? Or that your mind still functions at a competitive level?" He let out a sharp, cruel laugh, looking around the room for approval. "Look at you. Your skin is like weathered leather. Tough, old, and out of place in a modern luxury firm. You're 60, Anita. Your mind is as expired as your visa. You are a relic, and frankly, you're an eyesore in a company that prides itself on youth and beauty." A heavy, suffocating silence descended. The London delegates looked horrified, shifting in their seats. The Korean board members looked at their laps, unwilling to challenge the air. Anita felt the sting. not of the insult, but of the sheer, naked ugliness of it. She looked at her hands, the dark skin mapped with the fine lines of a life well lived, a life of hard work and black excellence that this stupid man couldn't possibly comprehend. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She slowly gathered her tablet and stood up. "Director Park," she said, her voice dropping to a level that made the room feel even smaller. "I have lived in Seoul for a decade. I have learned your language, your customs, and I have carried your failures on my back to keep this department afloat." She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze a physical weight. "My skin has survived suns you haven't stood under and battles you haven't fought. My mind isn't expired. It's seasoned. And today? Today is the last day you will ever have the privilege of ignoring it." She turned and walked out of the boardroom, the rhythmic click-clack of her heels sounding like a countdown. Behind her, at the far end of the hall, the elevator doors opened. A man stepped out, taller than Dae-hyun, with a sharp jawline and eyes that held the weary wisdom of the world. It was Kyung-min, the second son, returning from his exile. He stopped as Anita swept past him, a whirlwind of fuchsia and fury. He caught the scent of her perfume, warm vanilla and rain, and watched her go, his breath hitching in his chest. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew instantly that he had just seen the most powerful woman in Seoul. 2 days later, the aftermath of the boardroom explosion felt like the ozone-heavy air before a monsoon. Anita was at her desk in the darkened International Strategy Wing, the city lights of Seoul twinkling like cold diamonds outside the glass. She wasn't packing to leave. She was organizing her brilliance. If she was going to be pushed out, she would leave a trail of fire that would make them realize exactly what they were losing. Meanwhile, on the top floor, the chairman sat in a high-back leather chair that felt more like a cage than a throne. Across from him, his eldest son, Dae-hyun, paced like a restless predator. "She's a liability, father," Dae-hyun spat, his face still flushed from the board meeting. "A 60-year-old foreigner lecturing me? The disrespect?" "The only disrespect I saw," the chairman's voice cracked like a whip, "was a future CEO who couldn't answer a simple question about European trade law. You didn't just insult a woman, Dae-hyun. You insulted the only brain in that room that was keeping your department from a freefall." The chairman looked at his phone. A message had been delivered. "He is here." Kyung-min stepped out of the black sedan at the base of Hansung Tower. At 52, he possessed a quiet gravitational pull that his brother entirely lacked. Having lived in London for 15 years, he had traded the frantic corporate posturing of Seoul for a sophisticated, understated power. He wore a charcoal wool coat over a tailored navy suit. No flashy labels, just perfection. He was weary of the family feuds, weary of the cold steel of the business world. He had returned only because his father's voice on the phone had sounded fragile for the first time in his life. He took the private elevator to the executive floor, but on his way to his father's office, he saw a single light burning in the International Strategy Wing. Curiosity, a trait he usually suppressed, pulled him toward it. He stood in the doorway, silent. Anita was there, illuminated by the soft glow of 3 monitors. She'd removed her blazer, revealing a sleeveless black turtleneck that showed the elegant, strong lines of her shoulders. Her hair was pulled back into a regal crown. She was typing with a rhythmic intensity, her eyes scanning data at a speed that would have made a junior analyst dizzy. "The 2024/SH directive isn't a hurdle," Kyung-min said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that broke the silence like a cello. "It's a loophole. If Hansung pivots to local sourcing in Poland now, the tax credits would offset the shipping costs by 14.5%. Anita didn't jump. She didn't even look up at first. She simply finished her sentence, then slowly turned her chair. She recognized him instantly. The eyes were the chairman's, but the spirit was different. This wasn't the arrogant boy from the boardroom. This was a man who had seen the world. 14.8%, Anita corrected him, her voice cool and steady. If you factor in the regional labor subsidies in the Krakow Special Economic Zone. Kyungmin felt a phantom jolt of electricity. He stepped into the light, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You're Anita Richard. My brother is a fool. A loud, public, catastrophic fool. Anita leaned back, crossing her arms. She didn't offer the customary bow. She had given enough of her spirit to this company. And you are the brother from London. The replacement I've heard whispers about in the break room. I prefer the exile, Kyungmin said, walking closer. He didn't stand over her. He pulled up a chair and sat, leveling his eyes with hers. It was an act of equality that felt revolutionary in this building. I saw you in the hallway earlier. You looked like you were ready to burn the building down. I've spent my life around people who want power, but I've rarely seen someone who actually knows what to do with it. He looked at her monitors, the complex spreadsheets, the visionary strategy. He didn't see a 60-year-old woman or an eyesore. He saw a master at work. My brother wants you gone because you remind him of his own mediocrity, Kyungmin said softly. I want you to stay because I cannot win this chair without you. And frankly, I don't think you're finished with this city yet. Anita studied him. For the first time in 10 years, a man in this company was looking at her as a person, as a peer, perhaps even as something more. The weariness in his eyes mirrored her own, but there was a spark of something dangerous and exciting behind it. Why should I help you, Kyungmin? She asked, using his name without a title. Kyungmin leaned in, the scent of expensive tobacco and rain clinging to him. Because I'm going to give you the one thing my brother never could, the stage to prove that you are the most brilliant architect this company has ever seen. And because, he paused, his gaze lingering on the warmth of her skin, the depth of her eyes. Because I suspect we are the only two people in this tower who actually understand the cost of being underestimated. Anita felt a pull she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just corporate interest. It was a recognition of souls. The chairman set a test, Anita said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. If we're going to win, we don't just pass it. We rewrite the exam. Kyungmin's smile matched hers. I wouldn't have it any other way. The next morning, the air in the International Strategy Division was thick with the scent of a fresh kill. Security guards stood at the entrance to Anita's glass-walled office, their expressions stony and rehearsed. Beside them, Dae-hyun stood with his arms folded, a smirk playing on his lips that didn't quite reach his panicked eyes. On Anita's desk sat a single apmanjink, insulting cardboard box. Clear your desk, Anita C., Dae-hyun announced, his voice booming so the entire floor could hear. Gross insubordination. Harassment of a superior. Your contract is terminated, effective 30 seconds ago. We're cleansing the Department of Outdated Elements. Anita didn't reach for the box. She stood tall, her spine a column of unbreakable mahogany, her gaze fixed on Dae-hyun with a pity that infuriated him more than anger ever could. You're not just firing me, Director, she said softly. You're amputating the only limb this company has that knows how to walk in the dark. Get her out, Dae-hyun snapped at the guards. That won't be necessary. The voice came from the elevators, a calm, oceanic roar. Kyungmin approached, his stride unhurried, a folder tucked under his arm. He didn't look at the guards. He looked only at his brother. Father gave me the authority to build my own transition team for the succession trial, Dae-hyun, Kyungmin said, stepping between the guards and Anita. I've already filed the paperwork with HR. Anita Richard is no longer part of your division. Dae-hyun laughed, a jagged, nervous sound. Good. Let her go back to whatever hole she crawled out of. She's not leaving, Kyung-min countered, his eyes flashing with a cold, protective fire. She is my newly appointed chief advisor. She reports only to me. And if you so much as breathe in the direction of her office again, you'll be answering to the chairman for interfering with the succession protocol. The silence that followed was absolute. Dae-hyun's face turned a bruised shade of purple, but he had no move left. Kyung-min turned to Anita, his expression softening instantly. Advisor Richard, I believe we have a strategy to discuss. Somewhere less sterile. Later that night, the neon chaos of Itaewon blurred into the background as Kyung-min followed Anita down a narrow graffiti-tagged alleyway. He felt like a man entering a different world. She stopped at a heavy velvet curtain, tucked behind a nondescript steel door. Inside, the air was a hazy blend of expensive bourbon, vintage perfume, and the low, thrumming growl of a double bass. This was the Midnight Blue, a jazz club where the world felt timeless. You don't look like a man who spends much time in places like this, Anita said, shedding her professional armor. She wore a deep emerald wrap dress that clung to her curves, her hair shimmering under the amber spotlight. I've spent 15 years in places with white tablecloths and hushed voices, Kyung-min admitted, pulling out her chair. This feels like a heartbeat. The music shifted, a soulful, bluesy rendition of a classic. Anita closed her eyes for a moment, swaying slightly to the rhythm. When she opened them, the ghost of Hansung was gone. In her place was a woman of vibrant, soulful depths. My father used to play the saxophone in Savannah, she whispered, her voice like velvet. He taught me that you can tell everything about a person by how they handle a syncopated beat. Most people are afraid of the silence between the notes. Kyung-min leaned across the small, candlelit table. The space between them felt charged, a magnetic pull that made the corporate war outside seem like a distant memory. And what do you hear when you look at me, Anita? She studied him, the sharp lines of his face softened by the candlelight, the genuine hunger for connection in his eyes. I hear someone who has been playing the right notes for too long, but is finally ready to change the key. She reached out, her hand resting briefly near his on the table. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through Kyung-min that he hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't just attraction. It was a profound sense of belonging. They see a 60-year-old woman, Kyung-min said, his voice dropping to a private whisper. But I see a woman who has more life in her pinky finger than my brother has in his entire body. You're not just my advisor, Anita. You're the first thing in Seoul that makes me feel like I'm actually home. Anita's smile was slow and intoxicating. She raised her glass of neat bourbon. Then let's give them a show, Kyung-min. Let's show them what happens when you underestimate the architect. As the jazz singer's voice rose to a crescendo, the spark between them finally caught fire. A quiet, dangerous flame that promised to burn Hansung Tower to the ground. 3 weeks later, the chairman's office was as cold as a mausoleum. He sat behind a desk carved from a single block of obsidian, 2 folders laid out like death warrants. Hansung Heritage, the chairman announced, our cosmetics subsidiary. It has lost 40% of its market share in 3 years. It is seen as a brand for the dead and dusty. The task is simple. Revitalize it. Whoever shows the highest growth in quarterly projections by the end of the month takes the lead in this succession. Dae-hyun snatched his folder before his father had even finished speaking. He didn't look at Anita. He looked through her. I'll have the top idols in the country signed by midnight, he sneered. Money buys relevance, father. I'll flood the subways with billboards until the public has no choice but to buy. Kyung-min took his folder with a steady hand, his eyes seeking Anita's. She gave him a microscopic nod. The tilt of a queen who already knew where the gold was buried. For the next week, the 14th floor was a battlefield of ideologies. Dae-hyun threw 50 billion won at the problem. He hired a K-pop starlet half Anita's age and plastered her face across every digital screen in Seoul. The ads were sleek, pale, and utterly hollow. They sold perfection, a concept that was rapidly losing its grip on a generation hungry for truth. In the small, glass-walled war room assigned to Kyungmin, Anita sat surrounded by mood boards that looked nothing like the Hansung of old. There were swatches of deep bronze, photographs of textured hair, and maps of the African diaspora. "Heritage is failing because it's exclusive," Anita said, pacing the room with a cup of black coffee. "It tells women they have to look like porcelain dolls to be beautiful. But the world is shifting, Kyungmin. The global south is the new frontier, and the diaspora is the trendsetter." "You want to rebrand a traditional Korean house as a global, inclusive label?" Kyungmin asked, leaning against the table, captivated by the fire in her eyes. "I want to show them Black excellence," Anita corrected, her voice ringing with authority. "I'm calling in my network, my friend Zanelle in Johannesburg, my niece who runs the top creative agency in Brooklyn, and the influencers in London who don't just follow trends, they create them. We aren't going to buy the audience, Kyungmin. We're going to make them feel seen." The night of the preliminary results, the board gathered in the Innovation Lab. Dae-hyun went first. His charts showed a moderate spike in sales, mostly from curious teenagers and hardcore fans of his hired idol. "A solid 8% increase," he boasted, adjusting his tie. "Direct, expensive, and effective." Then it was Anita's turn. She didn't use a spreadsheet. She dimmed the lights and played a 3-minute film titled "The Skin We Inhabit." The video featured a diverse group of women, Black, Afro-Latina, South Asian, and Korean, all using Hansung heritage products. But the lighting was different. It wasn't the flat, bleaching light of traditional K-beauty. It was warm, golden, and celebratory. The soundtrack was a rhythmic Afro-beat fusion that made the older board members tap their pens unconsciously. "We didn't buy billboards," Anita addressed the board, her presence commanding every inch of the room. "We sent samples to the women who moved the needle of global culture. We leaned into the soul in Seoul. In 7 days, the hashtag Hansung Heritage has been used 5 million times. We've sold out of our entire deep tone moisturizing line in New York, London, and Lagos." She clicked a button. The final slide appeared. Revenue growth, 32%. Not from a marketing budget, but from cultural resonance. The room was silent. Even the chairman leaned forward, his eyes shielded by his glasses. Dae-hyun looked like he'd been slapped. His perfect idols were suddenly as interesting as yesterday's newspaper. "You used them," Dae-hyun hissed, pointing a trembling finger at the screen showing a stunning Black model with glowing skin. "This is a Korean company." "This is a global company, Director," Anita countered, her voice like silk over steel. "And beauty doesn't have a border. It has a pulse. Perhaps if you spent less time looking at your own reflection, you'd have noticed the world has changed." Kyungmin stood up, walking to Anita's side. He didn't say a word, but the way he looked at her, with a mix of professional awe and something deeply, dangerously personal, spoke volumes. The chairman stood up, his gaze lingering on Anita for a long, unreadable moment. "Round 1, the old man said softly, "goes to the second son." The morning after the Heritage victory should have been a celebration. Instead, it felt like the air in Hansung Tower had been poisoned. When Anita stepped off the elevator, the usual hushed murmurs of the office didn't just cease. They curdled into stares of blatant suspicion. On every television monitor in the lobby, the scrolling news ticker carried her name. The puppet master of Hansung. Leaked emails reveal foreign advisors plan to colonize Korean boardroom. Dae-hyun had been busy. Overnight, he had leaked a curated, distorted collection of Anita's private correspondence and early strategy drafts. Out of context, her blunt assessments of Hansung's stagnant culture were framed as contempt for Korean traditions. One email, where she joked with a friend in London about teaching the old dogs new tricks, was being blasted across the tabloids as proof of her manipulative nature. Anita walked toward her office, her chin high, though her heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. She found Dae-hyun standing by her desk, leaning back against it with a triumphant grin. "The press is downstairs, Anita," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "The Black Excellence brand doesn't look so shiny when the public thinks you're here to dismantle our heritage from the inside. Security is on their way to escort you out. For your own safety, of course." "You didn't just leak files, Dae-hyun," Anita said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. "You fabricated a narrative because you're terrified of a woman who doesn't need a pedigree to be your superior." "Doesn't matter," he whispered, leaning in. "In this country, sentiment is king. And right now, the sentiment is that you're a virus." The lobby was a gauntlet of flashing lights and shouting reporters. As Anita emerged, the wall of cameras surged forward. "Ms. Richard, do you have a secret agenda? Are you manipulating the second son for your own gain? Why do you hate Korean corporate culture?" Anita felt the heat of the lamps, the suffocating weight of the crowd. For a second, her poise wavered. The decade of hard work, the nights spent perfecting strategies for a company that now wanted to devour her. It all threatened to break her. Then, a hand, firm, warm, and steady, slid into hers. The chaos dimmed as Kyung-min stepped into the frame. He didn't just stand beside her. He interlaced his fingers with hers, locking their hands together in a grip that was as much a shield as it was a statement. The cameras went into a frenzy. This wasn't just a corporate defense. It was a scandal-shattering display of intimacy. "Director Kyung-min, what are you doing?" a reporter screamed. Kyung-min didn't look at the cameras. He looked at Anita, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world vanish. In that moment, seeing the flicker of vulnerability in the strongest woman he had ever known, the truth hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just respect. It wasn't just an alliance. He was deeply, irrevocably in love with her. He turned to the press, his face a mask of aristocratic steel. "The files you've seen are a desperate act of cowardice by those who cannot win with intelligence," Kyung-min announced, his voice carrying over the din. "Anita Richard is not a foreigner to this company. She is its heart. Every success Hansung has seen in the last decade has her signature on it, even if others were too small-minded to let her sign it." He raised their joined hands, the mahogany of her skin against the pale tan of his. A striking image of unity. "She is my chief advisor. She is my partner. And if you have questions about her loyalty, you can address them to me, because where she goes, I go." He led her through the crowd, his body positioned to take the brunt of the jostling reporters. Once they were inside the car, the tinted windows offering a sudden holy silence, he didn't let go of her hand. Anita looked down at their joined fingers, then up at him. "You shouldn't have done that, Kyung-min. You just made yourself a target." "I don't care," Kyung-min said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. He reached up, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw. "Let them aim at me. I've spent 50 years being the perfect son. I'd rather be a target by your side than a king without you." Anita felt a tear finally escape, tracking a path down her cheek. Kyung-min leaned in, and for a heartbeat, the world stopped. Not as a chairman's son and his advisor, but as two people who had finally found the only thing more powerful than the chair they were fighting for. The scandal had left the company in a state of tremors, but inside the chairman's private residence, a traditional hanok, hidden amidst the skyscrapers of Songbuk-dong, The world was deathly still. Anita sat on a silk floor cushion, the scent of pine needles and ancient paper filling the room. Across from her, the chairman didn't look like the titan of industry who held the Korean economy in his fist. He looked like an old man tired of the weight of his own crown. "My son is a fool," the chairman said, pouring tea with a trembling hand. "He thinks he can destroy a person by exposing their emails. He doesn't realize that some foundations are built on things that cannot be deleted." He looked up at Anita, his eyes clouding with memory. 10 years you've been here, Anita. People wonder why a woman of your caliber stayed in a place that didn't always see her. They think it was the salary or the challenge. "It was a promise," Anita said softly. The chairman pulled a small lacquered box from a drawer. Inside was a photograph, yellowed at the edges. It wasn't a corporate photo. It was a picture of a woman with a luminous, kind face. The late chairwoman, Min Jung, taken in a hospice garden a decade ago. "When my wife was dying in London," the chairman whispered, "I couldn't be there every day. The company was failing. I was a coward, hiding behind my work. But you were there." The secret history unfurled like a scroll. 10 years ago, Anita had been a high-flying consultant in London. She had met Min Jung by chance at a gallery, and a deep, unlikely friendship had bloomed. When the chairwoman was sick, Anita became her shadow, her confidant, and eventually, her protector. In her final weeks, Min Jung had made Anita promise one thing: go to Seoul, watch over my family. My husband is a stone, and my sons are lost. Be the conscience they don't know they need. "I didn't stay for the chairman's seat," Anita said, her gaze steady. "I stayed because she believed that Hansung could be something more than a machine. She wanted it to have a soul. I've spent 10 years trying to plant those seeds in the cracks of this building." The chairman set his tea down. For the first time, he looked at Anita, not as a tool or an advisor, but as the keeper of his wife's final wishes. "She told me about you in her letters," the chairman said. "She called you the architect, not of buildings, but of people. She said you had a way of seeing the beauty in the struggle." He paused, the mask of the neutral judge returning to his face. "However, Anita, I cannot hand the company to Kyung Min just because of a ghost's wish. This is a business. My sons must prove their worth. I will remain neutral, but know this." He leaned in, his voice a rasping whisper. "I finally understand why you didn't break when Dae-hyun threw his stones. You are anchored by a promise more powerful than his hate." As Anita left the residence, Kyung Min was waiting by the iron gates, leaning against his car. The moonlight caught the silver in his hair, making him look like a figure out of a noir film. "What did he say?" Kyung Min asked, his voice laced with concern. "He remembered," Anita replied, walking toward him. Kyung Min didn't ask for details. He saw the peace in her eyes, a peace that came from the truth. He reached out, his hand grazing her shoulder, a gesture of profound respect that had moved beyond the frantic heat of the previous night's scandal. "He's still going to make us fight for it," she warned. "Good," Kyung Min said, a sharp, determined glint in his eye, "because now I'm not just fighting for my father's approval. I'm fighting for the vision you've protected for 10 years. Let's go home, Anita. We have a final test to prepare for." As the car pulled away, the chairman watched from his window. He held his wife's photograph and whispered to the empty room, "You were right, Min Jung. She is the best of us." The air in Jeju was different, thick with the scent of salt spray, blooming camellias, and the damp volcanic earth. It was a world away from the sterile, air-conditioned suffocations of Hansung Tower. The chairman had called for a strategic pause before the final phase of the succession, sending his sons and their advisors to separate villas on the island. While Dae-hyun was reportedly throwing a lavish, desperate party for potential investors on the north side of the island, Kyung Min and Anita had found sanctuary in a quiet modernist retreat tucked into the cliffs of Seoul. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the East China Sea in bruises of purple and gold. Anita stood on the terrace, her professional suits replaced by a flowing, copper-colored silk caftan that billowed in the sea breeze. Her hair was down, a crown of natural, silver-flecked curls that she had finally allowed to breathe. The glass door slid open behind her. Kyungmin emerged, his tie gone, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the tanned, strong lines of a man who had aged like fine mahogany. "You look like you belong here," he said, stepping up to the railing, "like you were carved out of this island." Anita laughed, a rich, melodic sound. "I'm a city girl, Kyungmin, but I'll admit, the silence here is loud. It makes it hard to hide," he agreed. He turned to face her, his shoulder brushing hers. The proximity was electric. Without the hum of computers and the glare of fluorescent lights, the tension that had been building between them for weeks became a physical weight. Anita looked out at the water. "Back in Seoul, we have a war to win. Here, I feel like Anita, not the advisor, not the black excellence icon, just a woman who was tired of being strong all the time." Kyungmin reached out, his hand tentatively finding the small of her back. The warmth of his palm through the silk made her breath hitch. "You don't have to be strong with me, Anita. I've spent my whole life looking for a partner who could challenge me. I didn't realize I was looking for someone who could also see me." He stepped closer, closing the gap. The scent of him, sea salt and warm skin, swirled around her. He reached up, his fingers gently tracing the line where her dark velvet skin met the silver of her hair. "I know what the world says," he whispered, his voice vibrating in his chest. "I know they look at the numbers. They see 60. They see 52. They see the labels they want to put on us." He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark with an intensity that was both respectful and predatory. "But when I look at you, I don't see a number. I see a galaxy. I see every star you've had to birth in the dark to get to where you are. Your mind is a map of places I want to spend the rest of my life exploring." Anita's heart hammered against her ribs. "Kyungmin." "Age is just the time it took for the world to prepare me for you," he murmured. He leaned in, slow and deliberate, giving her every second to turn away. She didn't. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't a gentle first kiss. It was a collision. It was the taste of 10 years of loneliness being wiped away in a single, searing moment. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her flush against him, and Anita responded, her fingers tangling in his hair. The kiss deepened, tasting of the bourbon they'd shared earlier, and the raw, honest hunger of two people who had finally found their match. The steamy heat of the Jeju night seemed to rise up to meet them. He broke the kiss only to press his forehead against hers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I've wanted to do that since the moment you walked past me in that hallway," he confessed. Anita smiled, her eyes shimmering with a newfound fire. She reached for the buttons of his shirt, her dark fingers working with a confident, graceful rhythm. "Then why did you wait so long?" "I wanted to make sure I was worthy of the architect," he replied, his voice dropping an octave as he swept her up into his arms. The moon rose over the volcanic cliffs, a silent witness to a bond that was no longer just about business or succession. In the quiet of the villa, the invisible queen and the exiled son rewrote their history, one touch at a time. The transition from the salt-aired bliss of Jeju back to the steel and glass of Seoul felt like a plunge into freezing water. Anita sat in the war room of their new venture, the Hansung Global Pulse Initiative. The monitors that usually pulsed with green growth charts were now flashing a clinical, terrifying red. Every procurement order was stalled. every vendor payment was flagged. The door swung open, and Dae-hyun entered. He wasn't frantic today. He was wearing the smug, satisfied grin of a man who had finally found the off switch. He tossed a legal document onto the conference table. Temporary injunction on all discretionary spending for the second son's office, Dae-hyun announced, his voice vibrating with malicious joy. I convinced the audit committee that your global pulse is a high-risk drain on company liquidity. Until the final test in 48 hours, your accounts are frozen. You can't even buy a cup of coffee on the company's dime, let alone launch a global platform. Kyung-min stood, his face darkening. This is a blatant violation of the succession protocol, Dae-hyun. Father is in a closed-door meeting with the regulators. He won't see the appeal until Friday. By then, the board presentation will be over, and you'll have nothing to show but a pile of unpaid invoices. Dae-hyun turned his attention to Anita. He walked toward her, his eyes narrowed with a visceral, aging-obsessed hatred. I have to hand it to you, Anita. You've played a good game for a woman whose biological clock stopped during the Cold War. But look at you. You're 60. You're tired. You should be in a rocking chair on a porch somewhere, knitting sweaters and fading into the background where you belong. He leaned over the table, his shadow falling across her. The boardroom is for the vibrant, the young, people with a future, not relics clinging to a past they don't even belong to in this country. Anita didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She slowly took a sip of her tea, the steam rising around her face like a veil. When she set the cup down, the clink of porcelain against the table sounded like a gavel. You speak of the future, Director, but you are the only one in this room standing still, she said, her voice a low, steady hum. You think you've frozen my project because you've frozen the company's bank accounts. That is your first mistake. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek black titanium card. Beside it, she laid out a series of private wire transfer confirmations. The second mistake, Anita continued, is assuming that in 10 years of fixing your father's mistakes, I didn't build a kingdom of my own. I have been a consultant for 3 decades, Dae-hyun. I have diversified assets in London, New York, and Singapore. She stood up, her height matching his, her presence far outweighing his. I have just authorized a personal bridge loan of $15 million to Global Pulse. I am no longer just the advisor. I am the primary private investor. You didn't stop the project. You just removed the company's ability to claim the initial profits. Now, the platform belongs to Kyung-min and me. Kyung-min looked at her, his shock melting into a fierce, prideful grin. A rocking chair? Anita asked, tilting her head. I don't have time for a rocking chair, Director. I'm too busy building the chair you're about to lose. Dae-hyun's face drained of color. The document he had tossed so confidently now looked like a scrap of useless paper. You're insane, he stammered. You're gambling your life savings on Kyung-min? I'm betting on a sure thing, Anita replied. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a world to conquer. And the clock, my expired biological clock, is ticking quite loudly for you. As Dae-hyun stumbled out of the room, Kyung-min walked over to Anita. He didn't say thank you. He simply took her hand and kissed the knuckles, his eyes burning with a mix of adoration and resolve. You just put everything on the line for me, he whispered. No, Anita corrected, her eyes flashing with the fire of a woman who had never truly been invisible. I put it on the line for us. The atmosphere inside the Hansung Grand Ballroom was more akin to a coronation hall than a corporate meeting. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the nervous sweat of 300 high-level stakeholders. At the front of the room, on a stage of polished white marble, stood 2 podiums. Behind them, the Global Board, a terrifying assembly of venture capitalists from Silicon Valley, sovereign wealth fund managers from Abu Dhabi, and the sternest minds from Tokyo, sat in judgment. The chairman entered the room with a cane that struck the floor like a drum beat. He did not look at his sons. He looked at the clock. This company was built on the sweat of a generation that had nothing, the chairman began, his voice amplified by the silence of the room. But it will be sustained by the vision of the generation that sees everything. You have 24 hours to prove you are that vision. He turned to the board. The task is simple. You will present a 10-year roadmap for Hansung's survival in a world that no longer respects tradition. The winner will be decided not by me, but by the vote of these investors. The one who secures the most capital commitment by tomorrow evening will sit in my chair. He paused, his eyes flickering toward Anita, who stood in the shadows behind Kyung-min, a splash of regal gold against the charcoal gray of the room. The test begins now. The war room for the second son was a hive of controlled electricity. Anita had transformed the space into a global command center. On the screens, live feeds from Lagos, London, and New York pulsed with data. Dae-hyun is going to go for the throat with traditional numbers, Anita said, her voice a calm anchor in the chaos. She had changed into a tailored suit of deep burnt orange, the color of a sunrise. He's going to promise them stability and cost-cutting. He's going to tell them that Hansung is a fortress. Kyung-min, his sleeves rolled up, looked at the map Anita had drawn. And what are we telling them? We're telling them that a fortress is just a fancy way of saying a prison, Anita replied, her eyes sparking. We're telling them that Hansung isn't a Korean company anymore. It's a global ecosystem. We aren't selling products. We're selling the soul. We're going to show them how we've integrated the bridge loan I provided to create a decentralized supply chain that bypasses the very regulations Dae-hyun tried to use to choke us. It's a gamble, Kyung-min whispered, stepping closer to her. The tension of the deadline was a physical thing between them, but it only served to sharpen the magnetic pull they had felt since Jeju. Life is a gamble, Kyung-min, Anita said, reaching out to straighten his collar. Her touch was brief, but it grounded him. But I've spent 60 years learning how to read the cards. We don't just have a plan. We have the truth. Across the hall, the mood in the first son's camp was frantic. Dae-hyun was shouting at a team of terrified analysts. More growth? I don't care if the margins are impossible. Tell the investors what they want to hear, he barked. He turned to his chief of staff. And find out what that woman is doing. I want her deck. I want her data. I want to know exactly how she thinks she can win with her inclusive nonsense. Sir, she's encrypted everything through a private London server, the staffer stammered. Dae-hyun's eyes narrowed into slits of venom. Then find a way in. A 60-year-old woman shouldn't be better at tech than my entire IT department. If you can't get her files, create a diversion. I want her rattled before she steps onto that stage. As the sun began to rise over the Seoul skyline, the 24-hour mark approached. Anita and Kyung-min stood on the balcony of the tower, watching the city wake up. Are you ready? Kyung-min asked. Anita looked out at the horizon, her face a mask of serene, black excellence. She had survived a decade of being ignored, a week of being slandered, and a lifetime of being told she didn't belong. I was born ready, she said. They think they're watching a corporate presentation. They have no idea they're about to witness a revolution. The fluorescent lights of the Hansung Tower hummed like a gathering storm. It was 3 a.m., the dead hour, when even the most caffeinated analysts began to stumble. Anita had finally succumbed to an hour of sleep, her head resting on her arms in the war room. She didn't hear the soft click of the door. She didn't see the shadow that slipped toward the central terminal. A junior IT staffer, his face pale with the terror of Dae-hyun's threats, plugged a drive into the master console. In seconds, the global pulse roadmap, the result of Anita's 10 years of observations and her personal millions, was mirrored onto a black encrypted drive. By the time the sun hit the glass of the ballroom at 9 a.m., the betrayal was complete. The chairman sat like an ancient god of judgment as the board took their seats. Director Dae-hyun, the chairman rasped, you have the floor. Dae-hyun stepped onto the stage. He didn't look like a man who had spent the night in a panic. He looked radiant, wearing a smirk that was as sharp as a razor. He clicked his remote, and the giant LED screen behind him flickered to life. Kyung-min, sitting in the front row, felt the blood drain from his face. On the screen was the Seoul ecosystem, the decentralized supply chain, the partnership with the African diaspora, the deep tone moisturizing projections. It was all there, every innovative, brilliant, Black excellence strategy Anita had crafted in the shadows. Dae-hyun began to speak, his voice smooth and rehearsed. He presented the data as if it were his own epiphany, a visionary shift he had been planning for years. We must bridge the gap between our heritage and the global pulse, Dae-hyun said, stealing Anita's very words. The future isn't just Korean, it is a tapestry. The board members, usually stoic, began to whisper. They leaned forward, captivated by the genius of the plan. The Silicon Valley rep nodded vigorously. The Abu Dhabi fund manager was scribbling notes. It was a masterpiece of a presentation. Beside Kyung-min, Anita sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap. She watched her life's work being paraded by the man who had called her a relic only days before. Kyung-min reached over, his hand trembling with rage as he gripped her arm. He stole it, he hissed under his breath. That's our deck. Anita, we have to stop him. We have to tell the chairman. Wait, Anita whispered. Her voice was strangely calm, like the eye of a hurricane. Wait, he's winning the throne with your brain. Anita turned to Kyung-min. In the depths of her mahogany eyes, there wasn't defeat. There was a cold, shimmering calculation. Let him climb, Kyung-min. The higher he goes, the more air he loses. As Dae-hyun finished, the room erupted in a rare standing ovation from the younger investors. The chairman looked at his eldest son, a mixture of shock and suspicion in his eyes. A formidable vision, Director, the chairman said. You have secured preliminary commitments of $800 million. Dae-hyun bowed, basking in the light. He shot a glance at Anita in the front row, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. I didn't just fire you, his eyes said. I consumed you. And now, the chairman announced, his voice heavy with what sounded like mourning, the second son, Director Kyung-min. You have the floor, although, I must say, after such a comprehensive strategy from your brother, I struggle to see what else can be said. Kyung-min stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He looked at Anita. Go, she whispered. Trust the architect. As Kyung-min walked toward the stage, the room felt like a cold box for his ambitions. He had no slides, no deck. His brother had stolen the global pulse. He felt like a man walking toward a firing squad, while the woman he loved sat in the front row, watching her own genius be used to crown his enemy. It was the darkest hour of his life, but as he reached the podium, he saw Anita open her tablet and type a single command. The silence in the Hansung Grand Ballroom was a physical weight. Kyung-min stood at the podium, his hands gripped so tightly the wood groaned. Behind him, the screen still displayed the brilliant stolen Global Pulse logo, the banner of his brother's theft. Dae-hyun leaned back in his front row seat, the picture of victory. Well, Kyung-min, he called out, his voice echoing with mocking pity. Are you going to present? Or did you spend all your time in Juju and forget to do the work? A ripple of laughter moved through the board. The chairman sighed, his hand hovering over the gavel. If the second son has nothing to add, the second son has everything to add, a voice rang out. Anita Richards stood up, She didn't hurry. She walked toward the stage with the measured stride of a general entering a conquered city. She wore her gold suit-like armor, her beautiful hair catching the light like a halo. "Anita, sit down," Daehyun hissed, his face contorting. "You've been fired. You have no standing here." "Actually, Director," Anita said, stepping onto the stage beside Kyungmin, "I am the primary private investor of the project you just presented. That gives me every right to speak." She turned to the global board, her gaze sweeping over the billionaires and titans of industry. "Gentlemen, you were just presented with a roadmap to the future. It looked perfect, didn't it?" The Silicon Valley representative nodded slowly. "It's the most aggressive growth strategy we've seen in a decade." "It's a honeypot," Anita said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. The room went cold. Anita tapped a command into her tablet. Suddenly, the screen behind her flickered. The beautiful charts Daehyun had just shown began to bleed red. "The data Director Daehyun stole from my private server was a decoy," Anita announced. "I knew there was a leak in our IT department. So, I created a ghost deck. The logistics models he just showed you, they rely on tax havens that were blacklisted by the EU 48 hours ago. The supply chain routes, they pass through territories currently under maritime embargo." She looked directly at the lead investor. "If you commit the $800 million he requested based on those slides, Hansung Group will be bankrupt within 18 months. He didn't just steal a plan. He stole a ticking time bomb." Daehyun scrambled to his feet, his face a ghostly, panicked white. "She's lying. This is a trick. The data was—" He stopped, his own words trapping him. To claim the data was real, he would have to admit he stole it. "The data was what, Director?" Anita asked, her eyebrow arched. "Yours?" The chairman stood up, his eyes burning with a terrifying clarity. "Sit down, Daehyun. Now." Anita deactivated the screen entirely. She didn't need slides. She didn't need a deck. She stepped to the very edge of the stage, her presence filling the cavernous room. "Now," Anita said, "let's talk about the real strategy, from memory." For the next 40 minutes, the room was hers. Without a single note, Anita laid out a masterpiece of economic engineering. She spoke of adaptive heritage, a way for Hansung to utilize blockchain for ethical sourcing in West Africa, creating a circular economy that appealed to the Gen Z demographic. She spoke of the silver economy, turning her own age into an asset by showing how Hansung could dominate the untapped market of high-net-worth seniors globally. It wasn't just a business plan. It was a symphony of Black excellence. She wove together her Wharton education, her 10 years of navigating Seoul's rigid hierarchies, and her innate understanding of global cultural shifts. The investors stopped taking notes. They simply watched, breathless. It was the most commanding display of intellectual power any of them had ever witnessed. "We don't need a fortress," Anita concluded, her voice echoing in the rafters. "We need a bridge, and I am the architect of that bridge." When she finished, there was no immediate applause. There was something better, a profound, respectful silence. Then, the lead investor from Abu Dhabi stood up. He didn't look at Daehyun. He didn't even look at the chairman. He looked at Anita. "Ms. Richard," he said, his voice thick with awe, "I came here to invest in a company, but I think I'd rather invest in you. How much do you need?" Kyungmin reached out and took Anita's hand, his eyes shining with tears of pride. The invisible queen had just stepped into the light, and she had blinded everyone in the room. The final decision felt less like a business day and more like the dawn of a new era. The glass facade of Hansung Tower reflected a sky so blue it looked painted. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was funereal for some and electric for others. Daehyun sat slumped in his chair, his expensive suit looking like a shroud. The honeypot had not just ruined his bid for the throne, it had decimated his reputation. The board members wouldn't even meet his eyes. The old chairman walked onto the stage. He stood tall, looking out at the empire he had built, then at the sun who had almost burned it down, and finally at the pair who had saved it. A company is not its buildings, the chairman's voice boomed, steady and clear. It is the character of those who lead it. My eldest son showed us the shadow of our past. Greed, theft, and the arrogance of thinking youth is a substitute for wisdom. He turned his gaze to Kyungmin and Anita. My second son and his advisor showed us the light of our future. They showed us that brilliance has no color, no border, and most certainly no expiration date. He picked up the heavy, gold-inlaid seal of the chairman. By unanimous vote of the global board, and by my own decree, Park Kyung-min is named the new chairman of Hansung Group. The room erupted, but the chairman raised a hand for silence. He turned specifically toward Anita. And for the woman who moved a mountain in a country that told her she was invisible. The chairman began to clap, slowly at first, then with a rhythmic force. Then he did something no one had ever seen him do. He stood up from his ceremonial chair and bowed his head slightly toward her. The board followed. 300 of the most powerful people in the world rose to their feet. The sound of the standing ovation was like thunder. Anita stood in the center of it, her eyes shimmering, her head held at an angle that spoke of 1,000 battles won in silence. She wasn't just being thanked, she was being seen. In the hallway, away from the applause, Dae-hyun was being escorted by security. His cleansing of the office had come full circle. "This isn't over!" he hissed as he passed Kyung-min. Kyung-min stopped, looking at his brother with a pity that was far more cutting than anger. "It is, Dae-hyun. You weren't fighting me. You were fighting time, and time always wins." 24 hours later, Kyung-min signed the final papers on his new desk, but he didn't sit in the chair. He walked back to the doorway where Anita was waiting. They didn't stay for the champagne toast or the sycophantic praise of the board members who had doubted them a week ago. Anita and Kyung-min walked toward the main elevators. She had draped her fuchsia blazer over her shoulders like a cape. As they stepped into the lobby, the entire staff of the International Strategy Division was lined up. They didn't bow out of obligation this time. They bowed out of genuine awe. The ghost of Hansung was leaving the building as its savior. They reached the massive revolving doors. The sunset was hitting the pavement of Seoul, turning the city into a sea of gold. "Where to, Mr. Chairman?" Anita asked, her hand slipping into his. Kyung-min looked at her. His partner, his advisor, the woman who had turned his exile into a kingdom. He leaned in, kissing her temple in full view of the cameras, the staff, and the city. "To the future, Anita," he whispered. "I hear the architect has some big plans." Anita smiled, her face radiant with black excellence and the quiet joy of a woman who had finally been heard. She didn't look back at the tower. She looked forward. Together, they stepped out onto the streets of Seoul, their strides perfectly in sync, the most powerful, unconventional, and unstoppable couple the city had ever seen. The glass ceiling wasn't just broken, it had been ground into dust beneath their feet. The air on the rooftop of the new Hansung Global Hub was crisp, carrying the scent of the Han River and the electric hum of a city that never slept. It had been 1 year since the coronation. Anita stood at the edge of the Infinity Garden, looking out at the skyline. She was 61 now, but the media had stopped calling her a relic. Instead, the Financial Times had recently named her the North Star of the Pacific. She wore a traditional Korean hanbok, reimagined in vibrant African Ankara silk, a stunning fusion of the two worlds she had bridged. Behind her, the glass door slid open. Kyung-min walked out, looking younger than he had in his 40s. The heavy burden of the exiled son had been replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who was loved. "The board meeting is over," he said, sliding his arms around her waist from behind. "We just approved the foundation for the New York Seoul Tech Exchange. Your vision is officially a header on the budget." Anita leaned back into his chest, her eyes reflecting the city lights. "And the dissenters?" "There are no dissenters anymore, Anita," Kyungmin whispered into her hair. "Not after the dividends hit their accounts last quarter. They've learned that Black excellence isn't just a slogan. It's the most profitable strategy Hansung has ever seen." He turned her around to face him. In his hand, he held 2 glasses of vintage champagne and a small velvet box. Anita raised an eyebrow. "Another board proposal, Mr. Chairman?" "Not a proposal, a permanent merger," Kyungmin said, his voice dropping to that soulful baritone that still made her heart skip. He opened the box to reveal a ring set with a rare black diamond, surrounded by a halo of Korean white pearls. "I've spent a year watching you lead this company," he said, his eyes searching hers. "But I want to spend the rest of my life watching you lead me. I don't care about the numbers, the ages, or the optics. I just want to be the man who stands beside the architect." Anita looked at the ring, then at the man who had stood by her when she was invisible. She took the ring and slipped it onto her own finger, her dark skin making the pearls glow with an ethereal light. "You've always stood beside me, Kyungmin," she said, pulling him into a kiss that tasted of victory and peace. "Now, the world just knows where to look." As they stood on the roof of the tallest building in Seoul, the city below continued its frantic pace. But up there, in the silence of the night, the architect and the chairman weren't thinking about market shares or succession. They were looking at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise on a world they had rebuilt together. The invisible queen was invisible no more. She was the crown itself. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.